Good afternoon, David. This week's edition of Internet Weather. First of all, we'll take a look at the top 10 most ports for ending yesterday for the last week. As you can see in the table, basically the number one position has been taken by Telnet port, which is 23 TCP, followed by ICMP 0, which is for echo reply, typically associated with some DDoS backscatter. And number 3 is SSH port 22, followed by AT-TCP, which is known for HTTP, but most often abused by various botnets for propagation. 6379 is also used by various IoT botnets. Number 6 is at HTTPS for 443 TCP port. Number 7 is 9530 TCP, which I'm going to discuss a little bit further into what's happening on this specific port. And number 8 is 81 TCP, typical alternate HTTP alternate port, but it's also famously used by various partners like Mirai and various variants of IoT like GPON-based botnets. 9 and 10 is wrapped up by 2375 and 8080 TCP again, which is alternate HTTP port. And let's take a look at what's happening from our common backbone on 9530 TCP port. The graph we are looking at here is on x-axis is what is the parameter, in this case our port of interest, which is 9530, and on y-axis we have the timeline, the count of how much we are seeing in here. We are looking at the past 90 days of traffic just to show the trend, how it has been behaving since the past 3 months or so. As you can see here, there was little activity, I think around end of March and early April timeframe, and there was almost a very insignificant amounts of activity, but kind of picked up around, I think, third or fourth week of May, and it was at somewhat elevated levels. But I think since few weeks it kind of jumped up, and again, basically every week it's kind of creeping up a little bit. And right now we are seeing at about close to 140 million scan flows per hour. So this clearly shows some sort of botnet kind of recruiting activity and some sort of heavy scanning happening. So that being said, is there any increase in number of scanners occurring on this specific port? This is similar graph, but showing how many scanner IPs are involved in this case. As you can see here, most often times the number of scanners or IPs observed are very minimal, less than few, and it kind of increased. If you see with this increase in May time frame, it also increased, and again, the increase was because of the number of increase in the sources. Because of the corresponding increase in the sources, we are seeing the volume also increasing significantly. That's the most often times is a telltale sign of some sort of botnet recruiting and activities going on. Here again, x-axis is again talking about what's the port of interest here, and why we have how many scanners we are seeing in an hour. In this case, at this peak, I think, which is early hours of today, it reached about 3,000 to 3,100 scan sources per hour. And this is another view of a geo IP map of how the scan sources are distributed geographically. As we can see, it seems to be concentrated in some levels. I think most of in Indian subcontinent and some parts of Asia Pac and North and South American regions. So that's where most of the scanning sources are coming from. Okay, with that information, is there anything we could find about this specific port? This port is not a typically used port, but it seems to be associated with somewhat IoT kind of device like NVR, DVR, and security cameras. It seems to be associated with the devices made by Zenogami firmware-based devices, And I think whoever the manufacturer, this manufacturer has a poorly hidden insecure backdoor for administrative purposes. So this specific firm is associated with, as I said, with lots of DVRs, NVR, security cameras, and other closed circuits related devices. How is the backdoor? This is not the first time there was a backdoor found with this specific firmware related devices. I think there were at least 4 older security bugs discovered. I believe 3 in 2013 and 1 in 2017 on different occasions. And but unfortunately, they were not adequately fixed. What happens? How this exploit can be achieved? I think by using any of these folder security bugs, they can daisy chain and send some series of commands to these devices via port 9530 TCP. What happens is when the series of commands are sent to this port, whenever some of the devices which have high silicon chips, which is on Hawaii, with the specific xenonymy firmware. I think combination of this chip and this firmware results in leveraging, actually owning these devices. Once they find these devices on 9530 TCP by sending this series of commands, they technically own the device. I think they've opened a telnet service on these vulnerable devices. What happens is, once they found out the telnet service is open, they use some certain set of brute force attack against the root accounts. They were at least, I think, 6 to 10, I believe. I think at 6 or 8 hard-coded root logins were coded in the previous versions of these Xenogami firmware devices. So they have that list as well as some additional list to brute force and gain root access to these devices. What happens then? So now they got the root access, technically, basically jewels to the crown, right? Basically what they do is, then they start a telnet demand on another port, which is 9527 TCP, which is typically, I believe, used by debug port. But this kind of abuse has been seen by Mirai and other botnets in the sense some of these login passwords and credentials are leveraged by Mirai to basically brute force into IoT devices. So Mirai has different components to target various IoT devices, most likely like home routers, NVRs, DVRs, those kind of stuff. Why it was a lingering problem? The problem is when these 4 old security bugs in 2013 and 2017 were discovered, what the vendors did is they just disabled the telnet domain and they never removed the hard-coded credentials. So they kind of left open there and always ready to be exploited. So since what other tidbits we can glean from here? Since this being exploited for telnet, I think it's always better to monitor the primary telnet port 23 TCP in addition to 9530, 9527 TCP. Recommendations, I would say, since the vendor is not that responsible to closing the gaps rather than like having a band-aid situation, I think if somebody is not running these devices, maybe it should be better to disable access to 9527 TCP as well as 9530 TCP. But overall, if they could move away from these devices to some other devices, it would be a best bet. But there's no guarantee the other devices doesn't have any backdoors. But I think it's always better to go with some vendors who have a responsible security posture to fixing or addressing any vulnerabilities in a timely fashion. So that's some background about 9530, what's happening here. And clearly, I think based on this, there's some botnet, maybe the old botnet, maybe some new functionality, which are looking for devices with 9530 TCP. Pause a second. Okay, and this is another graph basically showing together activity on 9530 as well as 9527, which is telnet daemon port used by these devices. As you can see, it's not as relevant or prevalent as 9530 TCP in the past 30 days, but you could see a couple of times there was significant activity, like which can be seen with the blue spikes here. So there's some correlation here, and most likely there's scanning happening for devices with the specific firmware and the high silicon chips. And coming to the sources, I think from the short-term searches based on our reports, it seems to be heavily concentrated. Again, I go back to our GUI map here. Seems to be agreeing with this map where these scan sources are involved. Pause a second if you have any comments or maybe any observations you want to point out, David.
Yeah, no, I was saying, I know it's like 9530 and 9527, but you said monitor 23, but, there's not too much, other than normal, basically, activity, right, going across 23. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, that's correct. But okay, I would take back that. Maybe I'll try to answer here.
Well, that's the only reason why, because I see here, I mean, it's remained at number one, this week as well, same as last week. So again, not saying it's related to this, but, just because it has remained, looks like 2 weeks, number one, I thought maybe there could be some underlying that it's, using as well related to that.
I mean, most oftentimes every week we see a certain number of usual suspects in the top 10, like 23, right. 22, 80, because they're so widely known, and also most oftentimes everybody is looking for, any bad actor is looking for that some sort of foothold gaining on these ports. That's one of the reasons we always constantly see, but sometimes when some certain functionality is added by these malware authors, we see significant jump on activity, like we are seeing in 9530. For example, 9530 is hardly seen. Like you see here in this case, it was at 13th position, and they moved up to 7th position this week to come up onto the top 10. All right. Then moving on to the top 10 most sources probing. Here again, I would say most oftentimes the usual suspects here, but in this case, number one position is taken by the SMB port, which is 445. Which is known for, WannaCry and other Blue Keeper, other kind of vulnerabilities. That's one of the reasons everybody constantly scans for this port. Again, 23, 22, 8291, 8728. These are related to 4 and 5. These are related to one IoT botnet related activity. We have been seeing this since few months. They always come together. Sometimes 8291 has more activity, and sometimes 8728 picks it up. But like similar to the graph I've seen here, if we plot those graphs together, I think you always see the synchronized activity going on always. And 555 TCP at position 9 is related to ADB, which is Android debug bridge, which is heavily abused by lots of IoT botnets. And number 10, wrapping up, is 1433 TCP, which is for Microsoft SQL servers. I've checked all of these on our common backbone graphs, and these doesn't seem to have significant changes to talk further for today. But I have another protocol to discuss a little bit further from what we have been observing. Again, I'm pivoting back to most probed ports. But these are the next 10 most probes from positions 11 to 20. In specific, I want to touch base with the one at the number 15th position, which is 47, which stands for protocol 47, which is a GRE. Okay, I think a few weeks ago, I kind of talked about the increase in activity in protocol 47. The top vote here in the past 365 days. As you can see, there is considerably low volume of activity until the beginning of this month, at what time actually kind of spiked up a lot. And again, it kind of tapered off slowly, but the lower graph is for last 30 days of graph, and you see again the traffic seems to be coming up in this curve, and the bottom graph is basically what we have seen at that point of time when we did the first 47 GRE protocol based internet weather. Coming back, is there any change? I think when we talked about at the beginning of this month, there were about maybe 2,800 to 3,000 scanners were discovered, which were doing heavy scanning. But today, as of today, I think in one of the reports, there were about 23 to 2,400 IP addresses. Not as much as we have seen, but the scan sources are significantly rising. I think, again, we are seeing a little bit of upward trend on the activity on Protocol 47. What is Protocol 47? As I said, it's GRE, which is for generic root encapsulation, and it's a stateless protocol widely used in virtual private network for encapsulation. For example, if somebody wants to send IPv6 tunneling and IP4 data, then they typically use Protocol 47. Some of the DDoS mitigation vendors, they use this encapsulation of the traffic protocol for DDoS mitigations. That being said, GRE is also susceptible to large volumes of DDoS attacks, which are typical for Mirai. I think Mirai is one of the first botnets utilize the GRE flood attacks. For example, this is the snippet from the Mirai code, which has been released maybe 3-4 years ago, maybe more. In one of the code bases, there reference to GRE IP flood and GRE Ethernet flood. Basically, if you look at their options, they mention 6, I think that's for GRE IP flood, 7 for Ethernet flood. So that's some backstory about Protocol 47, and it seems like probably it's an act of a botnet, either to bring down one of the victims by use of a GRE IP flood, maybe some other activities. Probably nowadays the trend is you attack someone with some sort of DDoS attack, then get some ransomware out of them, basically demand ransomware to stop the attacks. There are various scenarios. Maybe the interest is basically do harm to the victims rather than anything non-malicious.